I'm hoping to make a point today, which I tried to make earlier. Because the civilizational model is running an error and it's not a default stance or off default stances, if one is beyond, let's say, struggling to survive, any achievement, any development, any discovery, any sort of even self-expression, art, etc. I'm giving my example to say is incomplete because whatever is being added to a civilizational model where at the tops of like decision making there is erroneous thinking that leads to errors that lead to existential threats, even so that your contributions can become nullified or used against you, or that they're still operating upon that brokenness that underlies the model. Now, if it were just a regular model and one was like, well, this alternative or that alternative, this would not apply. But because this error that I've given a case study regarding also, Israel, September 22nd, 2023 on, because this error is increasing civilizational entropy even for perpetrators, um, and we've reached a point where we can bring extinct species back to life and we can engage in a lot of complexity, and we also have an abundance of resources to engage in complexity of innovation, discovery, or even art. To be able to specialize to that extent on those domains and yet completely turn a blind eye to a very major error, which is like, for instance, we have a cancer and then we treat the fever, or we do something else to whatever, but we're not solving the cancer while it's in a stage where it can be solved. I just think achievements, developments, or discoveries can be made more complete on a model of coherence that's based in truth, that calibrates into the deeper truths of reality that we've established. So, yeah, if you go through my previous video, you'll see details on that. And I haven't added all points in my previous videos. I've mentioned there too that I'm not much of a video person, but I've also in the first one I made two errors as well. So I wish to clarify that, and I have clarified that in the final video. The errors were just in one detail in the very first video, I think, yeah. But hopefully it's a learning curve. So I'm keeping them up as a process and as a learning curve rather than like removing them and stuff. So yeah, the error that was being run, we have with, let's say, again, an arbitrary number, but 14,000 years of civilizational trial and error, millions and billions of years of data before that, and we tried everything, got to a point we now have experience of having tried different models and seeing what works better versus what works worse. We have now an understanding of psychology and mental health and even health in general that we didn't have before. We have an abundance of resources, an abundance of potential resources because of, let's say, even digital innovation. So that's led to industries that are intangible that go beyond just service industries. We have a much smaller world now because of commercialized air flights, which are relatively reasonable for people to try to take, and diversified talent all over the world, mostly. Uh, I just, we also have existential threats coming forward. So it doesn't have to be climate change, but it can. But also general like ice age shifts that have happened in history, and health, or like we had, for instance, well, I'm not going to bring that example up because that might be debatable to some. But okay, we can have health disasters, we can have natural disasters, and then we can even potentially have like space disasters where we're hit by a meteoroid or something. So with all of these sort of threats, and as well as technology that's developing to become potentially smarter than we are, in an insecure sort of environment, where if we're going to keep signaling that the best practical morality we've come up with for after all this trial and error and this data we've gathered and the lessons of world wars, after which our ancestors were begging us to be smarter than the decisions, the error that, for instance, Israel's lobby is trying to make, etc., since September 22nd, 2023, against Jews, against Israel, against the West, and against Earth too. Or like what we do to Sudan when we don't have to be that extreme against global citizens. With sort of technological advancements and developments too, we may no longer be, let's say, the biggest fish, and it is better to have at least tried a chance at better outcomes and signaling the potential for better outcomes by showing or signaling to, for instance, artificial intelligence that practical morality or practical reasonableness does not stop at execution. So that, oh, when it comes down to it, our leadership is making worse decisions. Israel's government, for instance, September 22nd, 2023 on, worse decisions to more loose ends and fewer returns, even for their interests and their allies' interests. And they turn their diminishing returns into backfires, whereas we've seen empires can go up to 600 years, 700 years. The West has finally stabilized. And the example of modern today's China. China also made errors, and that's not okay. All places have, though, mostly. But I'm giving examples of how they tried to limit themselves in what ways they attempted succeeding in. So they had internal issues, yes. It's said that there are elements of foreign exacerbation, but regardless, you should still treat your people well. Um, or if you look at today's Singapore, or if you look at Japan, they showed us that you can still succeed in the civilizational model without having to resort to necessarily going out of your way to kill kids in Sudan or kids in Gaza and so on, or go that far. So sometimes then it becomes resistance because some other party is trying a certain way. If we look at Africa's example, there were very many brilliant people in Africa who wished to develop, let's say, their part or their country, or and then were replaced by, let's say, the erroneous thinking of the prior king, who was a foreign king, who did not treat them well, and then had them sort of killed. We can take the example of how Belgium treated Patrice. But if it was a thing of the past, it would be fine. But September 22nd, 2023 on, done by Israel, and us being unfair to Sudan. But Israel has done the worst thing in 75 years needlessly. So it hurt its own interest to. If you're of average privilege, which means you're in a place where you can get, let's say, running water, or you're able to get 3 meals a day, and your health is physically not to the point that you're bedridden. It even made precedents in Sudan worse. So Israel normalized weaponized starvation and aid, etc. So the next year we were seeing that in Sudan. 2023, Israel was publicizing it. 2024, Sudan's problem in those domains got exacerbated. Able to have some sort of a life or some sort of like vocation, all to try to raise awareness, which is that the civilizational model is running in error, which is resulting in more existential threats than necessary, and is also bringing fewer returns to those running that error because that vision is limited and short-sighted. And it needs to be improved by bringing in the lessons of the past and trial and error, which the corruption of this current model actively blocks. So once we get to a more regulated foundation, which will still have problems, but is more coherent in underlying reality and its truths, which we've established, what civilization needs, what civilization is naturally going towards, but this like stubborn sort of corrupt blocking is intentionally limiting in artificiality, which is why civilizational entropy is increasing beyond levels that it would need to, even for perpetrators' interest. So if we can just protest and add to our work, add to our art these components, a little bit of pressure can go a long way towards better. And not better in an idealistic way. I think sustaining what's going on right now would be idealistic, or to think you're not squandering your interests in the process, or you're not creating more loose ends for yourself in the process. And yeah, so for instance, if we are getting to a point where innovating in the form of travel, or in the form of bringing extinct species back to life, or in the form of art and expression, but what it's doing is there's still that error being run that people in Gaza and Sudan are needlessly dying over it. So civilization can have citizens as stakeholders in a way that benefits those lobbies best. I've even talked about weapons lobbies. I've talked about diversity being preserved, prior natural freedoms being preserved, this not being top down or bottom up, but just being organic corrections. I've talked renovation or maintenance is necessary in most components, even in products, let alone most service or organizational components globally. But yet, in the civilizational model, there's just this pretense that it doesn't have to exist. So those are things that I would hope that you can look past sort of the quality of the previous video. I don't have a budget for this and stuff, and I don't want one. I'm not taking funding and stuff for it. It's just a sincere effort towards global, towards all possible sentience. I've explained that later. But yeah, so if you can look past the quality and stuff, and I'm not like a media person or trained person, um, I will add, I added this before as well, but like, if you're wondering, no, this is not with an organization, this is not any prior or future affiliation. This is a purely independent effort from one individual who's, I'm not being a media person or a journalist or anything like that, and I'm not profiting off of this either. I just think sentience deserves better, civilization deserves better, reality deserves better, and humanity deserves better than this backwardness when this is the idealistic way of running things and this is the way that's damaging things. And what I'm saying is the more realistic way of incorporating the like different components in a way that errors are being reduced and they're being streamlined better. So yeah. I absolutely also wish to add Israel's lobby, the Zionist lobby, etc. They don't have an excuse in saying, I was halfway through makeup and then I remembered at this point, oh, China's different, they have some strengths and we don't. The West had history and learning curves of industry, innovation, and enterprise, as well as like laws to encourage it and laws to keep them in check. And the West, for whatever reason, had uh, reached a point where it could claim more freedoms in its model than other parts. So other parts would not have as much of a chance to maybe innovate as the West did, or make mistakes or have learning curves. And so that's not a it's not a reason to say, oh no, but the West had to be excessively colonial or excessively cruel to the detriment of imperialism and colonialism. Because what it did in Gaza has hurt its imperialism and colonialism or even strategic sense. And there was no religious case to what Israel did either. In Judaism, at least, they're not Jewish, that's for sure. Because in Judaism, they're severely punished and they're no longer, they have no relation left with God. So, yeah.